In the final desperate years of World War II, the Allies unleashed tanks, bombers, and ships across two oceans. But one of their most effective weapons wasn't made of steel or gunpowder. It was made of rubber, paint, and imagination. This is the story of a secret U.S. Army unit so strange, so unbelievable, that for decades it remained classified, its existence buried beneath official silence and disbelief. It wasn't until half a century later that the truth came out. A group of artists, sound engineers, and designers had fought and fooled the German army across Europe. They were called the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. But history would come to know them by another name, the Ghost Army. It began in the spring of 1944, as Allied High Command prepared for the most ambitious military operation in history, the invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe. To win, they needed not just strength, but deception. The Germans had fortified every inch of coastline. Every move the Allies made could tip off Hitler's forces about where and when the invasion would strike. British intelligence had already mastered the art of deception, using fake radio traffic, double agents, and inflatable tanks to convince the Germans that the D-Day invasion would happen at Calais, far from its real target in Normandy. But once the landings began, the Allies would need a new kind of deception, one that could move with the army, create false battlefields on command, and fool the enemy's eyes, ears, and intelligence. That's where the Ghost Army came in. The idea started inside a plain office building in Washington, D.C. In early 1944, a small group of officers in the U.S. Army's top-secret operations branch met with representatives from the Signal Corps and the Corps of Engineers. They wanted to create a mobile deception unit, something that could mimic entire divisions in the field, not just a few decoys, but a traveling illusion, the appearance of tens of thousands of soldiers, complete with tanks, artillery, and radio chatter. The result was a unit of about 1,100 men, many recruited from art schools, advertising agencies, and Hollywood sound studios. These were painters, sculptors, architects, set designers, men who had spent their pre-war lives creating illusions for audiences. Now they would use those same skills to deceive an enemy that killed millions. Among them were art students from Yale and Cooper Union, fashion designers from New York, and even future icons like Ellsworth Kelly, Art Kane, and Bill Blass, men who would later become famous in the art and fashion world. But in 1944, they were soldiers with sketchbooks and a mission to use creativity as camouflage. Their official orders were classified as tactical deception. Their unofficial motto was whispered between them like a secret spell: "We must fool the enemy to save lives." Training began at Camp Forest, Tennessee. Under a shroud of secrecy, the men learned how to deploy inflatable tanks and trucks made of rubber and canvas, so realistic that from the air, they were indistinguishable from the real thing. They practiced setting up fake artillery positions, arranging dummy planes, and even leaving false tire tracks to trick enemy reconnaissance. But visuals were only part of the trick. The Ghost Army would also master sound, the art of acoustic warfare. Working with engineers from Bell Labs, they recorded hours of actual battle noises, tanks rumbling, engines idling, bulldozers scraping earth, even soldiers talking and hammering. These sounds were mixed and projected from powerful speakers mounted on half-tracks, capable of being heard 15 miles away. Finally, there was the third component, radio deception. Specially trained spoofers learned to mimic the radio traffic of real divisions, complete with authentic call signs, patterns, and styles. They'd pretend to be entire regiments, sending out messages that German intelligence would intercept and believe. Together, these three elements, visual, sound, and radio, would create a deception so convincing that German scouts, pilots, and spies would swear they'd seen massive Allied forces where none existed. It was art turned into a weapon. By June 1944, as Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy, the Ghost Army was already in England, waiting for their call to cross. They would not fight on the front lines, but their missions would take them dangerously close. They would set up fake divisions miles from real battles, drawing German artillery and aircraft away from actual soldiers. Their first test came in the hedgerows of Normandy that summer. As the Allies pushed inland, chaos reigned. Roads were clogged with vehicles, bridges destroyed, maps outdated. Amid this confusion, the Ghost Army was ordered to simulate the presence of the 2nd Armored Division, Patton's tanks, in a completely different location. Their goal to make the Germans think the real division was preparing for a breakthrough miles away, forcing them to reposition their troops. The operation required split-second precision. In one night, the Ghost Army inflated hundreds of dummy tanks and trucks, arranged them in convincing formations, set up fake command posts with radio chatter, and projected the sounds of engines and movement through the dark French countryside. Locals who stumbled upon the scene thought they were witnessing the buildup for a massive assault. But in reality, there were fewer than 1,200 men. By dawn, German reconnaissance planes flew overhead and reported what appeared to be a large armored concentration. The deception worked. The enemy repositioned its forces, thinning defenses elsewhere, and the real 2nd Armored Division advanced with fewer casualties. That success marked the beginning of a new kind of warfare, one fought not with bullets, but with illusions. Over the next several months, the Ghost Army would conduct more than 20 deception operations, each one more daring than the last. They were deployed in Normandy, across France, and deep into Belgium, always a few miles behind the front, always in danger of discovery. Their soldiers carried no heavy weapons. If the Germans discovered the ruse, they would be defenseless. Many of them later recalled the strange mix of fear and absurdity. One artist remembered sketching a rubber tank at dawn, while artillery boomed in the distance, thinking, if they find out what we're doing, we're dead men with paintbrushes. They slept in foxholes beside rubber trucks. They painted fake insignia on their uniforms to match whatever division they were impersonating that week. They learned to act, to swagger like veterans, to talk like tank crews, to move like officers. Every detail mattered. The Germans were watching from the skies, and one mistake, a tank facing the wrong direction, a track that led nowhere, could expose them all. By autumn of 1944, the Ghost Army's reputation among Allied commanders was growing. Though their work was secret, their results spoke for themselves. In one operation after another, they had drawn enemy fire away from advancing troops, created phantom divisions that diverted panzer units, and saved countless lives. But even as their illusions succeeded, the reality of war grew darker. Towns lay in ruins, civilians displaced, soldiers exhausted. For these artists-turned-soldiers, the irony was not lost. They were creating illusions of war amid the very real horrors of it. Some would later say that their sketches, drawn between missions, were their only way of staying sane. Then as winter approached, the Ghost Army faced their most dangerous mission yet, one that would push their deception skills to the limit and take them to the edge of survival. By December of 1944, the war in Europe seemed nearly won. The Allies had liberated Paris and were pushing toward Germany. The men of the Ghost Army, exhausted but confident, thought the end was near. They were already imagining what it would be like to go home, to trade in their camouflage nets and paintbrushes for their old lives again. Then everything changed. On December 16th, the Germans launched a massive counteroffensive through the Ardennes forest, a surprise attack that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. Tens of thousands of German troops poured through the snowy woods, cutting deep into Allied lines. It was Hitler's last gamble, a desperate attempt to split the Allied forces and capture the port of Antwerp. The American front collapsed in places, units were encircled, communications broke down, and panic spread across the frozen battlefield. The Ghost Army suddenly found themselves not behind the front lines, but dangerously close to them. For the first time, their illusions were not only tools of deception, they were shields for survival. The Ghost Army was ordered to the front, tasked with simulating reinforcements to slow the German advance. In the chaos, their trucks and half-tracks sped through snow-choked roads, headlights covered, radios crackling. They could hear the distant thunder of artillery and the roar of tanks echoing through the forests. When they arrived near the town of Bastogne, they faced a nightmare. German forces were advancing faster than expected. Entire divisions were missing. The line between real and fake armies blurred in the fog and snow. The men inflated decoy tanks in the freezing dark, their fingers numb, air compressors sputtering in the cold. Every hiss of air from a rubber Sherman tank sounded like a death sentence. They knew that if German scouts discovered that these tanks were hollow, it would be over, not just for the operation, but for them. Yet somehow the illusion held. From the air, Allied reconnaissance reported dozens of armored units holding ground. German spotters confirmed the same. The deception worked again. In those critical days, the Ghost Army's fake movements bought precious time for real reinforcements to regroup and strike back. The men would later joke that they fought the Battle of the Bulge with rubber tanks and phonograph records, but they also remembered the terror of it. The constant shelling nearby, the snow that soaked through their uniforms, the realization that art and imagination were their only defense against an army that showed no mercy. As winter dragged on, the war entered its final act. The Allies were crossing into Germany itself, and the Ghost Army was called upon one last time for their most audacious deception of all. It was March 1945. The Allies stood at the edge of the Rhine River, the last great natural barrier before the heart of Germany. The Germans had destroyed every bridge and fortified every crossing. To reach Berlin, the Allies had to get across. But the question was, where? If the Germans guessed the true crossing point, they could annihilate the invasion before it began. So once again, deception became the key. The Ghost Army received their orders: simulate the presence of 2 full divisions near the town of Wesel in northern Germany. Their fake buildup would draw German attention north, while the real crossing would take place to the south under cover of darkness. This operation would be bigger, louder, and riskier than anything they had done before. They called it Operation Verrassen. For weeks, the men rehearsed every detail. Rubber tanks and artillery pieces were positioned along the riverbank. Engineers constructed dummy pontoon bridges that gleamed in the moonlight. Sound crews blasted recordings of truck engines, hammering, and shouted commands through massive loudspeakers. Even local civilians were fooled. They watched what appeared to be a huge Allied buildup and assumed the crossing was imminent. Meanwhile, the real U.S. Ninth Army quietly moved into position miles away. But there was one problem. The Germans were watching too. Night after night, reconnaissance aircraft flew overhead, their engines humming like hornets in the dark. Searchlights probed the fields. German artillery occasionally fired at the decoy sites. The men ducked for cover as shells exploded among the rubber tanks, tearing holes through their canvas sides. Still, they stayed. Every destroyed decoy was replaced before dawn. Every illusion had to remain intact. One night, a small group of German soldiers infiltrated near the camp perimeter. They crept close enough to see the silhouettes of tanks under camouflage nets. They radioed back, enemy armor confirmed. The ruse held. When the real crossing began to the south, on March 23rd, the Germans had concentrated much of their defense around Wesel, exactly where the Ghost Army wanted them. The deception was a masterpiece. The real assault went largely unopposed. Allied forces crossed the Rhine successfully, breaching Hitler's final defensive line. Afterward, commanders credited the Ghost Army's operation with saving thousands of lives. For the men who had carried out the illusion, the aftermath was strangely quiet. They deflated their tanks, packed their equipment, and moved on. They weren't celebrated or even acknowledged. Their existence was classified, their missions erased from official records. Some of them went home, never knowing how much difference they had made. Others kept silent for decades, believing that no one would ever believe their story anyway. They had fought their war not with bullets, but with creativity, and creativity doesn't earn medals. But their work wasn't over yet. In the final weeks of the war, as the Allies closed in on Berlin, the Ghost Army continued to run smaller deceptions, guiding troop movements, concealing logistics, and keeping German intelligence guessing until the very end. In one eerie operation, they staged an entire field hospital out of thin air, tents, vehicles, and staff that didn't exist, just to lure enemy scouts away from a real medical unit nearby. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, the Ghost Army had completed more than 21 full-scale deception operations across Europe. They had marched through France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and Germany, always unseen, always pretending to be someone else. And when the guns finally fell silent, they packed up their rubber tanks and fake radios and went home, quietly, anonymously, as if they had never been there at all. When the war ended in May 1945, Europe lay in ruins. Cities were shattered, families scattered, and soldiers, victorious and defeated alike, struggled to understand what they had just lived through. For the men of the Ghost Army, victory was bittersweet. They had survived, yes, but there would be no parades, no medals, no public gratitude. Their names were left out of reports, their photographs locked away, their missions buried under the words, "Top Secret." They were told not to talk, not to write, not to tell anyone what they had done. And so they didn't. They returned home to quiet lives, to classrooms, to art studios, to office jobs and design firms. Some went back to painting, some to fashion, others to architecture or advertising. But in the backs of their minds, they carried the strangest secret of all, that they had once fought a war using nothing but creativity and illusion. One of them, Bill Blass, would go on to become one of America's most celebrated fashion designers. He rarely mentioned the war, and when he did, it was with a kind of sly grin, as if he knew a joke no one else could hear. Another, Ellsworth Kelly, would become one of the great painters of the 20th century. His work, bold, abstract, full of geometric precision, carried echoes of the patterns he once used to hide fake tanks under camouflage nets. Others became photographers, engineers, architects, creators who rebuilt the post-war world in peacetime, just as they had protected it in war. But for decades, no one outside their tight-knit circle knew what they had done. Their story existed only in whispers, at reunions, in old letters, in the unspoken bond between men who had once tricked the most powerful army in the world. Meanwhile, in military archives across Washington, thousands of pages of reports sat gathering dust, labeled "Deception Operations," classified. Even historians who specialized in World War II had no idea the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops had ever existed. When they looked at records of troop movements and battlefield maps, they saw strange gaps, odd inconsistencies, divisions that appeared in one place and vanished overnight. The truth was there, hidden in plain sight. But no one knew how to read it. For nearly 50 years, the Ghost Army remained a rumor, a footnote in a war filled with legends. Then, in the early 1990s, something remarkable happened. A man named Rick Bayer, a filmmaker and historian, stumbled across an old reference to a phantom division in an obscure army report. Intrigued, he started digging, and what he found would change the historical record of World War II. He discovered declassified documents, faded photos of rubber tanks, and field sketches signed by men who were still alive, veterans in their 70s and 80s, who had kept their secret for half a century. One by one, Bayer tracked them down. When he met them, he realized they weren't hardened soldiers or covert agents. They were artists, gentle, thoughtful, almost shy, men who had fought a war not by killing, but by creating. And yet, as they spoke, he heard a quiet pride in their voices. One veteran told him, "We didn't have rifles, we had paint and sound, but we saved lives, and that's what mattered." As Bayer interviewed more of them, the scope of their achievement became clear. The Ghost Army had faked entire divisions using nothing but art, science, and nerve, and had done so under the constant threat of discovery and death. Their missions were so convincing that captured German officers later admitted they had been completely fooled. Some even believed the Americans had developed invisible divisions that could appear anywhere at will. The deception had worked so perfectly that it entered enemy legend. But until the 1990s, the men responsible had never even received official acknowledgement. In 1996, the U.S. Army finally declassified most of the Ghost Army's operations. Historians and journalists began piecing together their story, and documentaries soon followed. When the surviving veterans gathered for a reunion that year, it was the first time many of them had spoken openly about what they had done. They brought photographs, sketches, and maps, proof of the invisible war they had fought. There were tears, laughter, and disbelief. Some of them hadn't seen each other in 50 years. Others had carried survivor's guilt, wondering if what they'd done had truly mattered. Now they knew it had. As the world learned about the Ghost Army, people were stunned. Teachers used their story in classrooms. Museums built exhibits to showcase their ingenuity. Historians called their work a masterpiece of tactical deception. And yet the men themselves remained humble. When asked if they felt like heroes, one veteran smiled and said, "No. The heroes were the guys up front, the ones who got shot at for real. We were just trying to keep them alive." But make no mistake, their work did save lives. Intelligence estimates later revealed that in several key operations, the Ghost Army's deceptions had caused the Germans to reposition thousands of troops, tanks, and artillery pieces away from actual combat zones. The result: fewer casualties, faster advances, and victories that might have cost far more without them. Still, recognition came slowly. For decades after the war, no official medals, no citations, no honors were given. The veterans were proud, but they were also fading. Many passed away before they ever saw their work formally acknowledged. It wasn't until 2013 that the U.S. Congress began drafting legislation to honor the Ghost Army with the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest civilian award bestowed by Congress. Even then, it took nearly a decade for the bill to pass. On February 1, 2022, 77 years after the end of World War II, President Joe Biden signed the bill into law. The Ghost Army had finally been recognized for their service and their courage. The surviving veterans, now in their late 90s, gathered in Washington to witness the moment. They wore their old unit patches, a ghostly white mask on a black field, and stood proudly as their story was told to the nation. Reporters asked them how it felt to be recognized after all these years. One of them said quietly, "It feels like the ghosts are finally visible." That moment, after decades of silence, was not just about recognition, it was about remembering that war isn't only fought with weapons. Sometimes it's fought with creativity, with courage, and with the belief that saving lives is the greatest victory of all. The Ghost Army had proved that imagination, when used for good, can be just as powerful as firepower. They had shown that art, that fragile human thing, could stand against the machinery of war and win. And in doing so, they left behind something that no enemy could destroy, proof that truth and illusion, in the right hands, can both serve the cause of peace. The war was over, but for the men of the Ghost Army, peace felt strange. After years of tension, fear, and secrecy, the silence of civilian life was almost too quiet. When they returned home, there were no brass bands waiting, no banners declaring their triumphs. Families welcomed them back, but even their loved ones didn't know the truth of what they'd done overseas. They couldn't know because the mission was still classified. Their discharge papers simply said they'd served in the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. To anyone outside the military, it meant nothing, and so these soldiers who had painted the shadows of war faded into the background of peace. Some found it hard to explain their experiences, even to themselves. They had spent years pretending to be other people, to wear the insignia of divisions that didn't exist, to speak in codes and false identities, to sleep under rubber tanks instead of steel ones. Now, they were expected to simply stop pretending. It was harder than it sounded. Many described an eerie sense of detachment. After all, they had seen war up close, seen the destruction, the burnt-out villages, the bombed churches, but their hands had never fired a shot. They had seen death, yet their job was to imitate life, to create the illusion of strength where none existed. That paradox stayed with them. One veteran later wrote, "We fought to save lives by lying convincingly. It's strange to live with that." Another said he sometimes dreamed of the sound of air pumps inflating rubber tanks, that steady rhythmic hiss that had once meant survival. For others, the transition back to normalcy came through art. Painters turned their wartime sketches into haunting canvases, abstract forms and muted colors that captured not blood or violence, but the eerie quiet between shell bursts. Photographers who once staged fake battlefields began to capture real life in a way that felt raw and human. And in every brushstroke, every photo, every design, there was something of the Ghost Army still there, the tension between truth and illusion. The military moved on quickly, Europe was rebuilding, the Cold War was beginning, and the art of deception was evolving. Psychological warfare became a science, but it lacked the strange poetry the Ghost Army had brought to it. The human touch, the creative spark that came from artists, not soldiers. Yet within intelligence circles, their techniques didn't vanish. Reports of their success circulated quietly among strategists. Some of their methods were later studied by the CIA and NATO. Inflatable decoys, fake radio traffic, and staged soundscapes became staples of Cold War deception. The legacy of the Ghost Army was alive, but hidden, buried in files stamped a secret. Years passed. Decades. The men aged, their memories fading but never forgotten. Many went on to build remarkable careers. Ellsworth Kelly's paintings would hang in museums across the world, bold, geometric, minimalist. Few would know that his sense of structure had been born under camouflage nets in France. Bill Blass would redefine post-war American fashion, dressing presidents, celebrities, and first ladies. But in his memoir, he wrote only one brief line about his time in the Ghost Army. "It was the best job I ever had." For others, the legacy lived quietly in their sketchbooks, their family stories, or the way they taught their children that creativity could be a shield as well as a gift. They didn't call themselves heroes, they called themselves lucky. And yet, in the shadows of history, something remained unfinished. They had helped win a war, but their country had forgotten them. Their art had saved lives, but no one knew it existed. Their ghosts, fittingly, had become invisible again. But not forever, because somewhere, deep in the archives of the U.S. Army, boxes of reports, photos, and field sketches were waiting to be found. Waiting for someone to see them and finally say, who were these men? When the guns finally went silent in May 1945, most soldiers could breathe again. The war was over, the killing had stopped, but for the men of the Ghost Army, silence felt strange, almost wrong. For years they had lived in a world of manufactured noise. Every day they'd created the sounds of war, engines, artillery, chaos. They'd painted shadows and sculpted fake armies from air. Now the world around them was real again, and yet it felt emptier somehow. Many of them went home with their secrets sealed behind their lips. They couldn't talk about what they had done, not even to their families. Their work was classified, buried in military archives, labeled simply Deception Unit, 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. To their wives, parents, and children, they were just ordinary veterans who'd done something with the Signal Corps. But inside they carried something few people could understand. The memory of saving lives through illusion, of waging war not with bullets, but with brushes and speakers. Some went back to art school, others became teachers, engineers, architects, designers. One sculptor named Bill Blass returned home and built a fashion empire. His ability to shape perception, to make the invisible desirable, came straight from his time in the Ghost Army. Another, Ellsworth Kelly, went on to become one of the most influential modern artists of the 20th century. His minimalist paintings, his obsession with shadow and color, all of it traced back to those nights in Europe when he had learned how small details could change what people believe. Even Art Kane, who later photographed some of the most iconic images in American culture, credited the Ghost Army for teaching him how to see. But some veterans couldn't leave the deception behind. A few struggled with guilt, the knowledge that they had survived by pretending, while others fought and died for real. They'd built illusions that sent enemy shells crashing into empty fields, but sometimes those shells had killed civilians nearby. War doesn't always reward cleverness cleanly. One veteran confessed years later, "We fooled the enemy so our guys wouldn't die. But every time we pulled it off, I thought, someone else is dying instead." It haunted him his whole life. Their secret unit faded from memory. The U.S. Army had no reason to publicize it. In the new Cold War era, deception was a sensitive word. For decades, their missions remained classified, locked away in dusty Pentagon archives. Even their medals didn't tell the full story. They had fought bravely, but on paper, their records looked unremarkable, just routine assignments in communications and engineering. It wasn't until the 1980s, when a handful of historians stumbled across declassified documents, that the truth began to re-emerge. One of those historians, Rick Beyer, interviewed surviving members of the Ghost Army. He found them in small towns across America, old men with gentle smiles, painters' hands, and long-buried memories. When they told their stories, their eyes lit up. They described the inflatable tanks, the thunderous sound trucks, the fake radio chatter. They described nights when they could see enemy artillery flash in the distance, and knew it was all aimed at the ghosts they had built. One said, "We were kids, really. We didn't think we were doing something historic. We just wanted to help." Another added, "We were magicians. Only difference is, our audience shot back." As the decades passed, fewer and fewer of them remained alive. By the early 2000s, only a few dozen veterans of the Ghost Army were still around, and they wanted recognition, not for glory, but for remembrance. They weren't seeking medals or fame, they just wanted history to remember that sometimes, creativity can save more lives than firepower. Their families began to speak for them. Sons and daughters wrote to Congress, petitioned the Army, gathered photos and letters. They shared their father's sketches, quick pencil drawings made between operations, showing inflatable tanks under moonlight, soldiers laughing as they painted unit insignias on rubber, truck headlights flickering through mist. They showed photos of makeshift stages, where sound engineers huddled over mixers in the mud. They wanted the world to see what the Ghost Army had done, not just as soldiers, but as artists who used imagination to protect life. One daughter recalled discovering her father's old army footlocker years after his death. Inside were rolls of film, notebooks, and small watercolor paintings. At first she didn't understand what they meant, then she found the words, 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, scribbled on the back of a photo. She Googled it, and the truth came flooding out. Her father had never fired a gun in combat, but he had helped save entire divisions. She said, he never wanted to talk about the war, now I understand why. It wasn't something he could explain, it was art and danger mixed together. By the time the truth fully came out, most of the original Ghost Army veterans were gone. But their story began inspiring a new generation of filmmakers, historians, and artists. A 2013 documentary, titled The Ghost Army, finally told the world what these men had done. Audiences were stunned. How could a story so incredible, a group of artists who fooled Hitler, have remained hidden for 70 years? That question became the fuel for the next chapter of their legacy. Because as the story spread, it wasn't just about the past anymore. It was about creativity as a form of courage. It was about how, in a world that worships power, a group of dreamers once used imagination to change the course of history. And it was about how the ghosts of that deception, the illusions built to save lives, still echo in every artist, designer, or filmmaker who believes that what you create can matter. For nearly half a century, the Ghost Army existed only as a rumor whispered among veterans. The files were sealed, the photos buried, and the missions officially erased from memory. But secrets have a way of coming back. In the late 1970s, a historian named Jonathan Gahn was researching Allied deception tactics for a book on D-Day when he stumbled upon an obscure mention of visual deception units. The reference was short, almost a footnote, but it hinted at something extraordinary: inflatable tanks, fake radio networks, sound effects on the battlefield. That single sentence became an obsession. Over the next few years, he dug through military archives, old orders and engineering records until he found it. A folder marked 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. Inside were reports, photographs, and maps. But what caught his attention most were the sketches, loose, hurried drawings showing fields of rubber tanks under camouflage nets, convoys of dummy trucks, men setting up giant loudspeakers in the mud. It looked like something out of a surreal war comic. He knew immediately, this wasn't a footnote. This was one of the greatest untold stories of World War II. Word began to spread quietly among researchers. The Ghost Army was real. But history doesn't move fast. The files might have been declassified. But few people knew where to look, and fewer still cared about a group of artists compared to the generals and battles that filled textbooks. It took another 2 decades before the world truly noticed. That turning point came when documentary filmmaker Rick Beyer met one of the surviving veterans, Bernard Bluestein, in the early 2000s. Bluestein was an elderly man by then, soft-spoken, kind, but with a spark that hadn't faded. When Beyer asked about his service, Bluestein smiled and said, "We were the biggest bunch of artists ever sent to war." Beyer was intrigued. He asked, "What do you mean?" Bluestein leaned back and said, "We didn't fight, we fooled." That single line changed everything. Beyer started tracking down every living member of the Ghost Army he could find. He drove across the country, visiting small homes and nursing centers, filming interviews with men who had carried one of the most creative secrets in American military history. One veteran still had his old sketchbooks, filled with drawings from France, Belgium, Luxembourg. Tanks, soldiers, churches, empty fields. Some were simple doodles, others were hauntingly beautiful. Another had reels of old film showing the unit at work, laughing as they inflated tanks, checking sound equipment, painting fake insignias. Each man told the same unbelievable story. They had been 1,100 soldiers pretending to be 30,000. They had staged entire divisions to protect others. And they had done it all with art, sound, and courage. When Beyer's documentary The Ghost Army premiered in 2013, it stunned audiences around the world. The film showed real footage from 1944, black and white shots of soldiers hauling inflatable tanks through the mud, stringing telephone lines that led to nowhere, and broadcasting the thunder of non-existent convoys. It looked almost comedic, like a wartime illusionist act. But as the story unfolded, the gravity hit hard. These men weren't just entertainers, they were risking their lives every time they performed. One wrong move, one captured signal, one curious German patrol, and the entire deception could collapse. They had no weapons to defend themselves, only their wits. And yet, they never failed. After the documentary aired, something unexpected happened. The descendants of Ghost Army veterans, children and grandchildren who had grown up not knowing what their fathers and grandfathers had really done, began reaching out. They shared photos, letters, and diaries. One letter, written in 1944, reads simply, "We are moving again tonight, building an illusion in the dark. If we do it right, no one will die." That line struck a chord. For the first time, people realized that the Ghost Army wasn't just a strange wartime curiosity, it was a story about humanity itself. About how imagination could protect life. Momentum built, Bayar and a growing coalition of families and historians began lobbying Congress to officially recognize the Ghost Army's contributions. It wasn't easy, the story was complex, the records scattered, and most of the veterans were already gone. But the few who remained alive spoke with quiet urgency. Bernard Bluestein testified that their mission wasn't about deception for deception's sake, it was about compassion. He said, "If we could make the enemy shoot at a rubber tank instead of a real one, we'd save someone's son. That's all that mattered." Another veteran, John Jarvie, told lawmakers, "We didn't have guns, we had art supplies, and that was our weapon." In 2022, after decades of advocacy, the U.S. Congress finally passed a bill to honor the Ghost Army with the Congressional Gold Medal, one of the highest civilian honors in the nation. The ceremony took place on March 21, 2024. Only a handful of surviving veterans were still alive to see it. They sat in wheelchairs under the lights of the U.S. Capitol, surrounded by family members holding photographs of those who couldn't be there. When the medal was presented, the room went silent. It bore the image of an inflatable tank, a radio antenna, and a paintbrush, symbols of the strange, beautiful tools of war they had wielded. For a moment, it was as if the ghosts had finally come home. One senator spoke at the ceremony, saying, "They fought with imagination, they saved lives with creativity, and they proved that even in war, art has power." A veteran in the front row whispered, "We were ghosts once, now we're remembered." The crowd stood and applauded. Tears filled the eyes of sons, daughters, and grandchildren, people who had spent their whole lives wondering what their loved ones had really done in the war. Now they knew. But even as the medals were handed out, one thing remained clear: the true legacy of the Ghost Army wasn't just in what they built, it was in what they believed, that truth itself could be reshaped. That courage could come in the form of a brushstroke, that deception, in the right hands, could be an act of mercy, and in the end, that's what made them unforgettable. History has a strange memory. It remembers the generals, the battles, the blood, but it often forgets the quiet victories. The ones won not by fire, but by imagination. The Ghost Army was one of those victories. For decades they were invisible. Their deeds hidden behind the veil of secrecy, their courage written in invisible ink. Yet even without recognition, they changed the way the world understood war. Because what they did wasn't just tactical, it was philosophical. They proved that perception could be a weapon, that creativity could save lives, that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do in war is convince your enemy to fight a shadow. If you walk through the fields of Europe today, where they once built their illusions, there's no sign of what happened. No memorials, no ruins, no traces of rubber tanks or sound trucks. Just quiet meadows, birdsong, and wind. But under that soil, echoes remain. In France, villagers still tell stories about the time an American division camped outside their town. A division that vanished overnight. In Belgium, a farmer once unearthed a piece of metal with a strange, hollow imprint. It was part of an inflatable tank valve. He didn't know it, but he was holding a fragment of a ghost. The men who built those ghosts are almost all gone now. Their hands, the same hands that once painted insignias and tuned speakers in the dark, are still. But their spirit lingers, because what they created wasn't just deception, It was art in its purest form. Art that protected, art that saved, art that defied death. One surviving veteran once said, "We were artists before the war, we became artists of survival during it." That line might be the truest description of the Ghost Army ever spoken. Think about it. Most of the men in that unit weren't soldiers by nature. They were painters, sculptors, set designers, architects. They came from art schools, advertising agencies, and studios. They knew how to see the world differently, and when the world fell apart, they used that vision to hold it together. They looked at the chaos of war and thought, what if we could trick it into sparing someone's life? That's not just creativity. That's compassion disguised as cunning. Their legacy reaches far beyond the battlefield. Every time a filmmaker uses sound to create tension, every time an artist uses perspective to change how you see something, every time a strategist wins through imagination instead of destruction, that's the Ghost Army's DNA at work. They didn't just fool Hitler, they changed how humans think about conflict itself, because they showed that in a world built on violence, the most radical act of bravery might be using your mind instead of your gun. In 2024, when Congress finally honored them with the gold medal, the design of that medal carried deep symbolism. One side showed an artist's hand sketching a tank, pencil lines transforming into machinery, imagination becoming reality. The other side depicted sound waves and camouflage netting, the invisible tools of war that these men had mastered. Around the edge were the words, deceive, defend, save lives. That was their creed, even if they never said it aloud. If you listen closely to interviews from the surviving Ghost Army veterans, there's something consistent in their voices. None of them talk about victory or pride. They talk about relief. Relief that their illusions worked. Relief that no one found out. Relief that they got to go home. They didn't see themselves as heroes, just as men who used what they knew best to make a difference. A few even joked that they were conscientious tricksters, but beneath the humor was a profound truth. They understood that saving lives through deception wasn't dishonorable. It was human. Today, the Ghost Army stands as proof that art and warfare are not opposites. They are two sides of the same struggle, the fight to shape reality. And when imagination serves mercy instead of destruction, it becomes something sacred. That's what those 1,100 men accomplished, without ever firing a shot. They built ghosts to protect the living. When you watch footage of them now, young men smiling as they inflate tanks in a field, it feels almost surreal. You can see it in their eyes, that spark of mischief, the thrill of creation, the awareness that what they're doing might just save thousands. You can almost hear them thinking, if we pull this off, nobody dies tonight. And they did pull it off, over and over. That's why their story endures. Not because of the deception, but because of the compassion behind it. The world has always been fascinated by ghosts, the idea that something unseen can still leave a mark. The Ghost Army were real ghosts, not of the dead, but of the living. Men who chose to vanish so others could survive. Their work reminds us that the line between truth and illusion can sometimes save lives instead of destroying them, and that maybe, just maybe, the most powerful stories in history aren't about who fought hardest, but who thought differently. Because in the end, the Ghost Army didn't just win battles. They rewrote what it means to fight. They proved that art could be armor, that sound could be strategy, and that imagination, fragile, human, and wild, could stand up to tyranny and win. They fooled the enemy, they saved the innocent, and they disappeared back into history, until we found them again. And now, they will never be forgotten.